Smacking against the chairs. Sweet.
Oh, I'm thinking of SPG. We want
It's very less when you can that or see it as message.
no.
We haven't done it yet. I brought it all over. Yes, you just want to know that. It should be.
So, I think we just need to give it to them.
Yeah, she has the cards out.
What's up, dude?
Okay, ready?
Ready.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome to Pizza and Politics for this semester. We're so happy to have you all here today. Today we're going to be talking about affirmative action. We got some wonderful panelists, which I'll give them a second to introduce themselves. But before that, we just want to kind of go through a couple of announcements. Tonight, the Center of Culture, Inclusion and Belonging. There we go. We got it out. They're having their Q and talk, so you can get tickets for that if you want to go to that. And then on this February 2nd, sorry, I didn't say I remember the date, we'll be having the criminal justice professors come and talking about criminal justice reform. And on the 16th, we're going to be doing an event about HB 90 is what the schedule is. So that'll be the current HB 90 bill that Utah is talking about will be about mandatory reporting for religious figures here in the state of Utah. So those are some of our upcoming events. And then in March, we'll be hitting the student elections. So just kind of a quick preview of our semester. So then without further ado, let's give a little bit of time to each of our panelists here to introduce themselves. We'll start here.
My name is Bob Weinstein. I teach Supreme Court cases and constitutional law here.
My name is Mike Nelson. I am the interim director for the Center for Inclusion and Belonging. I use he, him pronouns.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Canales. I am the president of our Multicultural Inclusion Student Association. My pronouns are she, her. And I work with all of our diverse students here on campus.
Hi, my name is Vince Brown. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics, and I teach political science and some law classes here on campus.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for being here and coming and speaking with us today. I'd love to start off this conversation first by giving some context. We're going to start off with Vince. You could say, what is affirmative action, and give some background and legal context, why it's relevant today. Why are we sitting here today? That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, you bet. We're sitting here today because the Supreme Court has several cases pending in front of it that are dealing with affirmative action. It's the first challenge in about 5 years to affirmative action policies. Affirmative action is a set of policies and procedures that are implemented to help overcome past racial injustice. They're primarily focused on racial minorities and women, and they deal with hiring practices, and they deal with education, which is, of course, important to us. In affirmative action, race or gender, sex can be taken into account when doing admissions or hiring. In terms of context, I can go all the way back. I can tell you about the recent cases. You let me know what you'd like to do.
Yeah, if you could just give a quick, brief overview of kind of, when affirmative action started and.
Well, technically we go back to the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, if you want to talk about affirmative action policies. But for our purposes, and people will know I say that too much, I try to not say for our purposes. But for our discussion today, what I think you want to go back to is probably the 1930s, when the Public Works Administration started setting quotas for the number of African-American employees that they were going to hire and equal pay for women. That led to a whole bunch of executive actions that occurred through the 40s and 50s, and then it culminates in a Supreme Court case called Brown versus Board of Education, which said that racial discrimination is inherently unequal. No return to 19th century case on that. That 10 years later after that, you get the Civil Rights Act, 1964 Civil Rights Act, which protects people from discrimination on the basis of race, religion, sex, color, national origin. And out of that growth of the civil rights movement from the 1960s, you get affirmative action policies that are implemented in the late 60s. And they set quotas for the number of people that have to be hired or are admitted into colleges. And they set quotas for racial minorities and for women to overcome past injustices. That was overturned in 1978 in a Bakke case. It said no quotas, but what universities did in response was they said, okay, fine, but we're going to take into account race when looking at the person who's applying for admission. The Supreme Court takes that up and says, yeah, that's okay, in 2003. And then in 2013, 2017, you have a series of cases that say, if you're going to consider race when hiring, and if you're going to consider race in admissions, it's got to be a compelling interest for the government. And then they had Fisher 1 and Fisher 2. And in Fisher 2, they said it is a compelling interest. Because what the compelling interest is, the court says, is diversity. They said, we want a student body that is diverse. That's going to lead to better outcomes for everyone. Now, what's happening today is there is a group of students, anonymous students, of Asian American descent who are suing Harvard and they're suing North Carolina. And they're saying that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Act in Title VI says you can't discriminate on the basis of race, and they're discriminating against Asian Americans in this case. And so, is that enough of a context for you of where we are? That's why we're doing this event today. In fact, the Supreme Court has kind of set all of our events for the last semester because these are such, important cases, big cases that really matter.
I'd just like to add one thing. One of the things that I think is intellectually fascinating, when Vince mentioned Brown v. the Board of Education, which said separate but not equal is unconstitutional in 1954. If you listen to the Supreme Court case that was just argued on affirmative action, and I guess I can tell you I firmly believe affirmative action is dead. Both sides, the liberals and the conservatives, claim that Brown v. the Board supports their position. Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice, said the 14th Amendment, equal protection, it's always been about equal protection for the individual, every single one of us, not just one race over the other. The liberals say, well, that's not the case at all. Brown v. the Board was enacted because there was racial disparity. And if you look at the Equal Protection Clause, they were saying they were being denied equal protection. So they both hugged that precedent, which is kind of intellectually fascinating because you normally don't see that, especially with a landmark case like Brown v. Board.
Thank you. Yeah, and adding a little bit to this context, Kimberly, I want to ask you real quick, how would you define diversity and why is it important? As the president of MESA, you deal with this all the time.
I think diversity itself is a complex topic, and not everyone will see diversity the same way. But for me, diversity is being able to walk into a room and embracing and respecting and valuing the fact that not everyone is going to be the same. And it's being able to look at all these different backgrounds and working together to try to make our environment a better place. And for me, on a daily basis, diversity is something that I love, and it's something that I see bring a lot of value to our institution and to my life personally.
I think that you do well to speak with Justice Thomas because as recently as the end of October, he said he doesn't even understand the meaning of diversity.
And like I said, a lot of people might not understand it because in their personal lives, they've never seen it. And a lot of communities, especially here in Utah, they don't recognize diversity perhaps because they think it's just based on race or ethnicity. But I always say there's a lot of diversity even within Utah. The non-LDS and the LDS, already a huge cultural difference.
So it's being able to recognize differences between communities and respecting them and valuing them.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to add is just that when we look at that term diversity, we've got to understand that there's those identities that are a part of that. When you hear like culture, right? The assumption is that when someone talks about my culture, that is maybe race and ethnicity. But when we look at culture from the APA, American Psychological Association, culture is just basically the different social groups that have shared knowledge, language, beliefs, history. And so when you look at maybe like athletics, right? As an athlete, there is an athletic culture. Like if you're a volleyball player, you're talking about I had 5 kills in my last game. Athletes know that language, they know that meaning. Where if you're a gamer and you're in the gaming culture and you're like, I had 5 kills that game, they're gonna be like, oh yeah, you're a noob, whatever. So they have that identity. So there is diversity just in even language. And it's part of identity and culture that's not just race and ethnicity.
I just wanted to add that when you talk about diversity, a lot of the people that favor affirmative action say, well, students, you're going to live in a pluralistic society. When you're done with college, you're going to be living with minority Americans, white Americans, or whatever. So it's probably a good idea for you to start that in college so that you'll be better prepared when you go into the workplace for a pluralistic society. The counter to that is take Harvard. Harvard has all of these legacy admissions for people that give a lot of money for their kids. And there's an argument to be made, well, if you eliminate those, maybe those places could be filled by minority Americans. So they are all over the board on those positions. And one of the things that I hope we can get some feedback on, I was mentioning this to Maddie and Ben yesterday, is this school does not have that problem because if you apply, you're in. But I'm wondering, how would you come out if that wasn't the case? How would you come out if the admissions group could consider your economic status, your geography, your race in terms of getting in? And maybe some of you would not get in. For example, there were 44,000 applications to Harvard last year. They admitted 2,000. So I'm wondering, how would you react to that? Would you think that in the interests of affirmative action, you'd be willing to be denied admission like Baki?
And what actually makes this all so complex right now is these suits that are pending before the Supreme Court. And the reason why it makes it complex is because it's not a group of white students bringing the case like they did back in Fisher. It's a group of Asian American students who are saying, well, if affirmative action is to overcome past racial injustice, we've experienced that, and yet we're being denied admission with higher scores. And so the argument in front of the court, when you listen to the oral arguments, gets quite complex because they're saying, even though Harvard, I think, admits 21% of its student body is Asian, whereas 6% of the population is Asian, they're still saying that, we're being denied on the basis of our race or ethnicity. And that's why this case is making things a little more complex than they normally would have been. And I agree with your assessment about, maybe we'll talk later about how it's going to turn out.
Well, kind of jumping into affirmative action a little bit more, Mr. Weinstein, we know that you've lived through the rise kind of affirmative action. Back when you were in school, a lot of these court cases we talked about were being put into effect. Can you give us kind of your experience on how it was initially received and how it went initially?
Well, when I was in law school, it was the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination. And when I think about it now, some of the arguments of Justice Roberts and the conservatives, frankly, ring true. What happened in the aftermath of that, where there were virtually no African Americans in most of the law schools, major law schools, is the Princeton waived any application fees to take the LSAT exam. And race was really considered on its own for admission into law school, as though that applicant would start out, as Justice Alito said, 5 yards ahead. Well, as a result of that, in my law school, there were about a dozen African Americans that came in. And frankly, through no fault of their own, but because of how horrible their primary and secondary education was, they really didn't have the tools to compete. We set up tutorial programs. I was a tutor for the freshmen. And really consistent with what Justice Roberts said, it perpetuated racial inferiority on the part of the African American students. And so there is some talk now, why don't we have federal funds available and have college students out in areas of low educational values tutoring, so that we can essentially develop a real good pipeline for admissions into higher education. But at least in my experience, without consideration of anything other than race, it was a colossal failure.
Thank you for giving us that insight into you going through and experiencing that firsthand. Mike, I'd like to pass this off to you. Previously, we'd spoken about, as the world's becoming globalized, that we're seeing secondary elementary education getting better. I'd like to ask you, from your perspective today, pivoting today, what does affirmative action look like in your workspace and for the students here on this campus? How has that affected you?
That's a good question, because I come from like a unique background, because one is that I grew up on the Navajo reservation in Arizona, and so as Bob mentioned, like that elementary school and that second elementary school that was just inferior, that was literally the life that I lived. Like when I moved to Utah in sixth grade, I still didn't know my multiplication tables. We're talking, we just had really inferior support on the reservation. And so I remember we had one student that came here, he was 43 years old, and I told him he had to attach a PDF to it. He didn't know what a PDF was. At 43 years old, he didn't know what a PDF is, because there was that technology barrier. So when I get here to Utah, I had a lot to catch up to. It. Thankfully, like Utah Tech and Dixie State at the time was an open enrollment. And I see that with students. Like we have students that are coming in, and we aren't necessarily affected by it as much, because as an open enrollment institution, we give opportunity to those students who might not have been had an opportunity elsewhere. But when it comes to employment, for example, like in our area, we look at who's going to be the best fit for the position. And in our department, like that's one of those things where like people expect that we should have diversity in our workplace. But at the end of the day, like I'm the interim director of my department. I've been in my department for 7 years. I want the best person. And we have had multiple identities in different positions. I have had a white African American Black student coordinator. We have had a Native American Pacific Island student coordinator, right? So it isn't necessarily like, oh yeah, we need to make sure that we hire a Hispanic student person for someone that's going to be working with our Hispanic Latin American students. Spanish speaking is definitely an important aspect. But on that end, again, we want to make sure that we're getting the best person. Understand that, like for us, we know that there are obstacles for those people that are coming in, and so are those things that we take into account. Like all things being equal, yeah, we want to get the best person at the end of the day.
Cool. Thank you so much. And kind of going into how it's affected the workplace or how it's transitioned over time, going back to you, Mr. Weinstein, how have you noticed it changed in the business world or just over the years? Like what effects have affirmative action had over the, since it's
I think it's improved dramatically. I know when I got out of law school because of my faith, I was denied even an interview with many of the major law firms. I see that changing, but I think going into the business world with affirmative action probably died, and I can pretty much bet the store that the Supreme Court in June is going to destroy affirmative action. Well, because of Title VII, you can't discriminate in business on the basis of race. But what's going to happen when people are clamoring for more minority Americans on police force? What's going to happen when big business says, we need more minorities if we're going to compete globally? What is going to happen if people say, well, we just need more minority teachers in our system? So there you're going to have a clash with Title VII and affirmative action. And with affirmative action dead, the focus is now going to be on the business sector. What about federal projects insisting on minority contractors? All of that is going to be litigated and really. So, yes, it's changed, but it hasn't changed enough. Harvard is the classic example. You graduate Harvard, it's a pipeline to the CEOs, the big law firms, the medical schools. You can't deny that. And if affirmative action is dead, I have some statistics here that will tell you that for African Americans at Harvard, it will go from 14% to 6%. Hispanics, 14% to 9%. That necessarily is going to translate into far fewer minorities as CEOs, prominent lawyers, doctors, whatever. A long way to go.
There might be a way out, though. So if affirmative action is overturned, and I agree, it's very, very. Bob and I go way back. He was on the other side of a case in California when I was a very young lawyer, my second deposition ever, and Bob was on the other side. And he just completely wiped me out. So I've known Bob a long time, and we've never predicted the Supreme Court, and we will on this one. I can tell you which justices I think we're going for. I can at least get to 5. But that doesn't look. California went through something similar to this with their university system, and there are alternatives like socioeconomic status and considering that. And I think that's probably where certainly the business sector will go if they're receiving some sort of funds, and I think probably will happen with the university system. Would you guys agree with that? Or yeah.
Interestingly, Vince, there are 9 states that prohibit affirmative action. California is one of them. And as a result of that, their private schools, which can embrace affirmative action, are doing quite well. Stanford. But the studies are showing that, like at UCLA, Cal, at Berkeley, the minority population has dropped off significantly. So it is still a problem.
Kimberly, I would love to go to you next. And, you are entering this workforce that might be shaping into something that doesn't accept racially conscious admittance or hiring from affirmative action being changed. So how has affirmative action affected you today? And what do you think your future is going to look like if this changes?
I think this topic first started when I was looking at first applying to college back when I was in high school. I remember being a senior in high school. I was in a humanities class, and I remember the topic being affirmative action. And a student had commented, a white student had commented, I don't get any scholarships. I'm not getting any college admissions because it all goes to the Hispanics. And I said, well, let me know what that's about because I need to get in. So I think the common misconception is that it's taking opportunities away from one community and it's being handed to separate, marginalized, underrepresented communities, and it's really not the case. It's never about taking opportunities from someone. It's about being given the opportunity to sit at the same table. So from the time, I think I even said, like, I think I was privileged enough to not understand affirmative action, and I was the one who needed to understand it the most. Now that I've gone through my 4 years, I'm graduating here in May. I think I would hate to see all my progress go to waste, and my extracurriculars, my student leadership, my grade point average be seen as less because of my background, and to not be offered certain jobs or certain college admissions because of my identity. I think it's a shame, and I think it's a shame if that would be the case for all the students that I work with. Another misconception is that it's just for minorities, whether that be ethnicity or race, when really this could be affecting, the socioeconomic status of poor white communities. People don't really take that into consideration, and I work with students of all backgrounds, whether that be, ethnicity. I work with the LGBTQ community. We work with students who are neurodivergent. There's a lot of people who are affected by this, and I think the first step to looking at this concept as a whole is who is affected by it. As far as myself, I would want employers to see me for my qualifications and not for, who I am physically, or whatever misconceptions or, misinformed preconceived notions that they might have about my community and other diverse communities.
And I'd add to that. I think that's great. It's given the opportunity to be at the table or be on the same field to play with everybody else. And that's one of those things that, like Kim said, it's not taking opportunity away. It's just being able to at least be considered for other, to be a part of. And that's important, to at least have that opportunity to be there. And then, and that's what a part I like about it is taking the quota away, right? That quota piece that was removed, now that at least it seems a little bit more equitable, because now you can be considered without, like, okay, well, we have to have X many, and just you're that check in the box. No, I'm not. I'm now at least more likely to be considered. Now, if I don't make the cut, I don't make the cut, but at least I was considered.
And kind of looking into that and thinking about, Utah Tech, I kind of bring it a little bit closer to home. How does this, is there any effects that, we currently have here as an open enrollment school, with affirmative action in place that will change if it's overturned or diminished? That can be to anybody, especially you, Mike, I guess.
I'll let them go first.
I personally don't think that there's going to be any impact whatsoever on Utah Tech as long as there's open enrollment and everybody that applies gets in. But in listening to these well-placed arguments that you're making, the 6 justices on the Supreme Court come back very sarcastic to that. They will say, Justice Roberts, it's a sordid business divvying us up by race. In terms of giving racial preferences to minority Americans, Justice Roberts says the way to end racial discrimination is to end racial discrimination. So you see, it's really a two-sided coin here, and they are polarized beyond belief.
Yeah, and to be that sarcastic piece, like calling the justices the way that it is right now, that's another thing. But when we look at the history of this country was founded on a lot of that privilege that was developed and established and still in place as a system. And so knowing that there is those power dynamics, those opportunities, that's just in place. I don't think that, again, as Utah Tech, it's not going to affect us because we're an open enrollment. But one thing that I can say is that now that we are a polytechnic university, and we are the only one in the state and the region, I would not be surprised in the future that as we become more prestigious, that there are some of those limitations on acceptance, and that might just be GPA, that might just be socioeconomic status or whatever, because um, that is almost kind of the natural progression of what a polytechnic might become, is having those STEM programs, having some of those things. I wouldn't be surprised if in the future we do start to have admission standards, and that's when it will start to affect our students.
So looking at, did you have something to say, Kimberly?
I was going to add to that. I think that another thing I've heard a lot from students is, that affirmative action like guarantees you the spot. It doesn't. It's never handed to people. You still have to work just as hard. You still have to be qualified for that position. I mean, nobody's going to hire you if you're not qualified. So that's another obstacle. Perhaps they don't have the access to the education or the access to the tools, the resources. So I think one of the main things is being able to acknowledge that there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to this topic.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I really appreciate you bringing that insight for the misconceptions, just clearing some of that air as well. Were you going to say, Vince?
Yeah, I just want to make the point that if these cases are decided the way Bob and I think they are going to be, it's not going to do away with the Civil Rights Act or anti-discrimination laws. It'll simply be focused on affirmative action, and may just be focused on affirmative action in education. Some people are talking about it might just be limited there, not going into hiring. So I just wanted to make that clear as a legal point.
The hope is.
Well,
the slippery slope
right.
that happens.
Yeah. Well, they'd have to do away with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and to the contrary, actually, they've expanded it. The court a couple of years ago expanded the definition of sex in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to include gender identity, to include a whole list of other things, expanding the definition of sex. So, and that was Alito that wrote that, which really shocked a lot of us, because Alito is very conservative. And so that was kind of interesting. So they'd have to get rid of that, but I don't know.
Cool. So now that we've kind of established a little bit of, what affirmative action has done and what could be changing for us here as a university, but also more generally broad. Mr. Weinstein brought up that, hey, there could be ramifications, looking at Harvard, that some minorities are going to, be diminished in their presence at some of these prestigious universities, or looking at Berkeley. What mechanisms do you think we can put in place that could ensure diversity in the future if this is overturned? That's kind of open to anyone.
I'd like to start. I think I'm grateful that we live in a time where things aren't the same as they used to be. These conversations are happening. There's awareness when it comes to marginalized communities, and we're having these conversations. So first, that's a great step. But I think another one is having the establishments, such the ones that we have here, like the Center for Inclusion and Belonging, the Disability Resource Center. We have the resources here at the university that will help educate others on what's happening and what needs to be done and what our students are needing, and what resources as a university, as an institution, we can provide for them to be just as successful as anyone else.
That very question, Maddie, came up in Fisher 1. And Justice Kennedy sent it back to the lower court saying, you've got to come back and prove to us that there are no neutral alternatives to affirmative action. Otherwise, if you can prove that, then we'll really consider affirmative action. Well, I think if you talk to most lawyers, they'll tell you that's an impossible proof. How do you prove a neutral alternative for minorities?
Do you think that there's been conversation on, instead of focusing on racially conscious admittance, that instead we're going to pivot to socioeconomic admittance and having diversity proved that way? Do you think that is a viable way to progress for the future?
Well, that is some of the criteria at Harvard. Harvard considers geography, socioeconomic background, and race. The deal is that you cannot just mechanically apply race. It can be narrowly considered along with other things. And that's probably what's going to be struck out.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's a lot of factors in, like that region and socioeconomic status. And one of the things that I think that might open the door is starting to remove some of those legacy admissions, because that gives an unfair advantage for work that the individual hasn't done, but my parents did. Once your parents graduate, all of a sudden you're not a first generation student. Okay, and so you lose that status. So those legacy scholars are like, oh, I got in because my dad. I think that once you start to remove some of those, then it might open up the door for more opportunities for other people to come in. And it's not just like, I got a pocketbook, my parents have got their name on the building. I think that might help to remove some of those people that might not necessarily be qualified.
Sweet. Vince, you have something else you want to add?
Oh, I was just going to say, are we going to go to the audience?
Yep, that's exactly where we're going. So I just want to make sure.
I'm not
So-
used to being up here as a guest. I'm used to primarily moderating these events. I think you guys are doing a great job.
No, thank you. So yeah, now we're just going to open up to the audience. We want to make sure you guys can have your questions answered, and have our panelists respond to them, or just have any comments heard. So if you have any questions or any comments you'd like to give, please feel free to raise your hand or some experiences you want to share.
We've got one over here.
So this is a bit more directed at you, Bob. I apologize, but you mentioned the destruction of affirmative action will affect business and boost the need for minority workers, if I understood you correctly. Do you think that that's going to affect international business and hiring prospects for persons of international status?
I do. I don't believe that the Supreme Court, in the decisions they're facing now, Chapel Hill and Harvard, are going to affect the workplace. I think that'll be the next step. But then, as Vince points out, they're running into Title VII, which recently said that sex is included, and they're running into the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But businesses are already clamoring, saying, we're doing all kinds of business in China. We're doing all kinds of business in India. We need those minorities to exploit the global marketplace. With your generation, Africa is going to become a major, major player internationally. And so the businesses are going to want that. And I think a lot of businesses, because of that reason, are favoring an affirmative action. They want that pipeline to turn out qualified people for their businesses.
Hi, I had a question. If anyone on the panel may have been following kind of the high school equivalent to Harvard, which is the Thomas Jefferson High School in Fairfax, and if you have any inclination as to whether this upcoming Supreme Court case would impact that at all.
I don't believe it would. One of the best ranked high schools in the country. No, I don't think so. I think this is directed at admissions in college. It's directed, and so I don't know. What do you think, Bob? I don't.
I agree with you.
I don't think.
And the other thing to bear in mind about that is, remember earlier I mentioned how important it is for you to academically be involved in a pluralistic college, because when you're going to live in a pluralistic society. Well, look at the major core of the justices on that Supreme Court. Kavanaugh, private education his entire life. Fancy elite East Coast schools. Gorsuch, the same thing. Amy Coney Barrett, very strict Catholic education. These 3 justices that are for sure going to end affirmative action have never lived in a pluralistic society. They don't have a clue as to what it's like or the ramifications of it.
And the Supreme Court has said in the past, and they could still say this in the future, because of what you were talking about, how you can take the arguments from Brown all the way up and argue them both ways, that diversity is a compelling interest for the government. That having a diverse population in the schools is beneficial to all. Compelling interest is about as high of an interest as you can get. We typically talk about national security as a compelling interest, or we'll talk about protection of children as a compelling interest. They've named that as a compelling interest. The argument is that in the Harvard case with 21% Asian Americans, but still what the students are arguing is that they're being discriminated against as Asian Americans because their scores are higher and they're being excluded so that other people can. And it goes back to what you were saying. That was the argument. When you listen to the oral arguments, by the way, the oral arguments in this case, they're online. Go listen to them. It's fascinating. They actually said, no, this is stigmatizing minority populations. To your point, Kim, that's what the other side was arguing. They were saying this is a stigma that's being put on people because it's telling the rest of the population, no, they're not qualified. That's not what happens at the elite schools. You talked about the admissions. That's not what happens at elite schools. Everyone there is qualified. It's just that there's a huge number of people that are being excluded, maybe with the exception of legacy. But my experience was that everyone was qualified, and there was a whole number of people that weren't able to get in. And so that's what they're making the argument. They're flipping the argument on affirmative action. And I think we know who's going to vote. I'm not sure about Kavanaugh, to be honest with you. I don't know which way he's going to go. I think they'll probably go, but it doesn't. They don't need him. Still got 5. So, but no, I don't think it'll affect K through 12. That's a separate thing. And by the way, I'm certified diversity advocate. I sit on a lot of hiring committees, and the policies of the university won't change. I mean, as far as what we're doing here, they're still going to be trying to hire a diverse group of people. It's just whether or not they're going to be able to kind of check off that box, of race. That's what's going to happen. So we'll continue our policies.
So I work in human resources at my organization, and I've actually been very fortunate to see the efforts that are being made to promote diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And something we've kind of determined just within our organization, at least, is that a big part of promoting this equality for everyone comes down to helping people understand, educating them, and also helping to shift the culture. And that's something that, depending on where you're from, you may not have great access to. My question is, what can we do as emerging students at a technical college like this? What can we do on an individual level to help people understand and help educate our community about the importance of this?
Unless you have something. Oh, thanks. I'd say, and I was speaking to you guys yesterday about this. I think the very first thing you should do, perhaps if you've never thought about affirmative action, maybe try to step into some of these students' shoes. I said, I'll ask this as in general to everyone here. Have you ever applied to school or applied to a job interview, or you're ready to get interviewed by someone at a job? Did you ever take a moment to think maybe you weren't going to get hired because of your name, or because of the texture of your hair, or your accent, or perhaps this color of your skin? Did it cross your mind? Because the case is, for a lot of these marginalized communities, that is the case. That kind of has to go through our mind. To think that I might not get a job because of that, to me, it's a shame. And I think it's important to understand that that's what a lot of students are going through. But that's a thought they have to have. So first, I'd say probably place yourself in that position, and how would you want to help other students who might be in that position?
This is it starts with you as an individual. To be open and willing to learn. And I think at the end of the day, that's what's really going to help you, is just to be able to be willing to learn something new from someone else, right? Because, you really can't be an ally if you aren't at least familiar and at least kind of on the same page. So I think one of the things that like someone can do is just learn about cultures. Like I would encourage everybody if they have an opportunity to do a study abroad or travel overseas or something like that. Because if you have like let's say lived in the bubble of southern Utah or Utah in general, right? It's a different culture. It's definitely a different culture. And if you have been outside of the state, and people who come here, they're like, whoa, culture shock, southern Utah, St. George, Utah. Living somewhere else, going somewhere outside your bubble, overseas, that at least will give you an opportunity to experience a lot of racial, religious diversity, social economic diversity. And that's one of those first steps, is just start to know it yourself. And then from there, then you can start that process of helping to change the climate at the culture, being able to recognize, like, for example, religious holidays. So this past beginning of the semester, we had one of our staff send out an email like, hey, just so you know, these are some of the religious holidays that are coming out. I had a student who told us about their experience on Ash Wednesday, that they had a teacher try to wipe something off of their forehead because they're like, oh, hey, they're completely unaware about, the Catholic religion and Ash Wednesday. And you're like, that is something that's just like, whoa. And so that's just like one of those things that you could do to start out as an individual, as a student.
I'll just add a little bit to that. Something that I'd say is that sometimes you don't know who's going through it because it's not a visual thing that you can see. So take into consideration maybe your coworker, maybe your best friend, maybe a family member. It could be things affecting their lives that we're not even aware of. And most times these communities, we don't like to talk about it. We're told, don't talk about it. Like, try to make it work however you can. But sometimes I'd say just take a step back and realize they might be going through something and they can't help it. So just bringing more awareness to the diversity within a room.
Cool. Thank you, everybody. If there's no more questions, let's just give our panelists a big round of applause and thank them for coming. We appreciate everyone for staying this long, and hope to see you guys all again on February 2nd. So that'll be our next Kids in Politics. Until then, have a great day.